Coming up on Arirang News, South Korea has concluded its mission to evacuate nearly 400 Afghans from Kabul, people who'd worked with the Korean government in the past. Most of them have now arrived at a temporary shelter in Jincheon County. South Korea is seeing an increase in people seriously ill from the coronavirus, causing some regions to face a shortage of hospital beds. With the Chuseok holiday coming up, the authorities will soon announce what the rules will be on gatherings. And Samsung Electronics grew its market share in the NAND flash memory market last quarter to 34%. Lots of investment going on in the sector by Samsung, but by other players too, which could shake up the market. It's 5 p.m. here in Seoul. Thank you for joining us on Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. South Korean chipmaker and tech giant Samsung Electronics held on to its #1 spot in the NAND flash memory market in the second quarter. In fact, it grew its market share to 34%. Lots of deal-making in the sector right now, though, that could shake up the rankings. South Korea's SK hynix looking to acquire Intel's business, and Western Digital reportedly in talks too. Ji-young has the details.
Samsung Electronics expanded its presence in the global NAND flash market in the second quarter of this year, continuing to hold the biggest market share. In a report released by market tracker TrendForce, the South Korean tech giant had 34% of market share in terms of sales in the April to June period, up 0.5% on quarter. Also, it logged second quarter sales of around $5.59 billion, up 12.5% from the previous quarter. Samsung's growth outperformed the industry average of 10.8% during the second quarter. NAND flash memory chips are primarily used to store data in devices, including smartphones, cameras, and data center servers. The report said the growth in sales was mainly driven by strong chip demand and price hikes. Strong demand for computers and storage devices like solid-state drives led to an increase of some 8% in shipments for NAND flash chips and a roughly 5% rise in prices compared to a quarter earlier. South Korea's second-largest chipmaker SK hynix ranked fourth with 12.3% market share. But after its deal to acquire U.S. tech giant Intel's memory chip unit gets approval from regulation authorities, it is expected to be the world's #2 NAND flash chip manufacturer with around 20% of the market share. Japan's Kioxia was the runner-up player in the market with around 18% of share, and United States Western Digital had about 15%, ranking the third. Meanwhile, one of the world's major contract chip makers, TSMC, is reportedly raising its prices as much as 20%, which is set to cause significant impact on the global semiconductor market. According to Japanese news outlets, the Taiwanese semiconductor foundry's higher price is expected to take effect late this year or next year, although the spokesperson declined to comment on actual prices. Amid the global semiconductor shortage, this would be the company's steepest single raise. Ji-young, Arirang News.
Today marks the official release of the new foldable smartphone lineup from Samsung Electronics. As of Friday, the Galaxy Z Fold 3 and the Galaxy Z Flip 3 are available in some 40 countries, including South Korea, the US, Canada, and Britain. In commemoration, Samsung has invited 1,000 fans who signed up in advance to an online fan party it's calling Foldable Day. Those people can join the event on the metaverse platform IFLAND at 8 p.m. Korea time. By October, Samsung says the foldable phones will be available in a total of 130 countries. And South Korea's LG Electronics has been named the most reliable brand in the refrigerator sector by the U.S. publication Consumer Reports. Its ranking of most and least reliable refrigerator brands gave LG the highest marks in 4 categories, including French door fridges and side-by-side models. LG attributed its high marks to the inverter linear compressor, which pushes warm vapor towards the back of the fridge so it can be cooled off and cycled through again, rather than using energy to cool more air. South Korea's national health insurance premium will rise 1.89% next year. The decision was finalized Friday morning by the Health Insurance Policy Deliberation Committee. Payments for workers under employer-sponsored health plans will increase to 6.99% from the current 6.86%. This means the average monthly premium paid by employees will increase by slightly over $2. For so-called local subscribers who do not work for a company, the average monthly payment for a household will increase by just under $2. The rate has climbed 2 to 3% each year for the past 4 years. Time now for an in-depth look at the market news on this Friday, and for that I'm joined on the line by Mr. Daniel Yu, Global Strategist at USFK Securities. Mr. Yu, good afternoon. Thanks for coming on today.
Good afternoon.
Well, earlier this week, Samsung Electronics announced an investment plan for the next 3 years worth an astounding $200 billion. It's expected that the vast majority of that will go into chips, and now the U.S. firm Western Digital, which is number 3 in the NAND flash sector, is reportedly in talks to merge with the sector's number 2 player, Kioxia of Japan. What does this mean for the Korean industry, and what do you make of this report?
Right. If you look at the Samsung Group, they have announced total of 240 trillion won of investment over the next 3 years in order to secure the future growth engines and expand the technology leadership in the post-era of COVID-19. Total amount of 880 trillion won, which is about 75% of the amount, will be allocated within South Korea. They're saying that they will be hiring 40,000 plus more employees by end of 2023. If you look at the level of the R&D expansion and infrastructure investment, this is one of the highest number that has been announced so far. As you said, the other company, which is competitor, Western Digital, have talked about merging with Japan's Chuseok holdings, and they'll be spending about $20 billion. But with the announcement of this news, the share price of the company fell by more than 4%. Clearly, we think that the overall memory chip market is expected to show very strong growth rate over the next several years, and maybe even further, given the fourth industrial revolution that we're seeing right now. Globally, the chip demand is continued to be in a hot area with the AI development and fourth industrial revolution accelerating in the future. We think that Samsung's very strong investment is something that's needed in order to keep their leadership within the memory chip businesses. We think that this area is a highly capital intensive, and therefore it is very difficult for the small companies to enter. The entry barrier is very, very high. So as you can see, the level of investment size is so large that the competitiveness of the small companies is going to be relatively small. So we're not too worried that this kind of merger news is going to impact that negatively for Samsung. Overall, as you know, Samsung and SK Hynix combined has more than 70% market share of the global memory chip side. And obviously the entry barrier is extremely high and the demand side is picking up very nicely. So therefore, we think that Korea's the leadership within this industry should remain quite high.
Well, we're coming up on Jerome Powell's big speech at the Jackson Hole Symposium, and ahead of that, stocks on Wall Street were down on Thursday. The attack in Afghanistan could have been a factor in that too. The S&P down almost about 0.5%, the NASDAQ about 0.6%. What's the story in the global markets?
Yes, as you said, U.S. market did go down slightly, about 0.5% plus yesterday. If you look at the U.S. market's trend, since last Friday, it had shown very strong number, continued to show very strong rise. And if you look at NASDAQ, it was hitting the record high level well above 15,000 level. But as of yesterday's correction, it did go down to below 15,000. The reason for that is because, as you said, the Afghanistan impact, but more so is because everybody's waiting for this Jackson Hole summit, and Jackson Powell, the Powell will be talking about the possibility of the tapering, and that has resulted into some uncertainty within the market. However, starting the tapering doesn't mean that U.S. will be raising interest rate anytime soon. We think that the level of the interest rate rise is going to be taking somewhat of a reasonable period of time. The first time of the rate hike, we don't think that it will happen until 2023. So we have more than probably 2 years of the room for the market to continue to enjoy the current ample liquidity. Tapering, yes, it is probably negative news for the liquidity condition, but it's just the size of the purchasing is declining. And if you look at the level of the purchasing of the asset purchasing program, it is 3 times bigger than what it was of 2009. So therefore, the speed of that declining should be accelerated as the signs has been very strong with the U.S. economy recovering not quite nicely. So as gradually the economy recovers, but nevertheless, if the productivity ratio is rising and that the labor participation ratio remains very low for U.S., we don't think that inflationary pressure is going to long last, and therefore we don't think that U.S. interest rate hike is going to happen anytime soon. So therefore, overall valuation mechanism is indicating that U.S. market is still very cheap. So therefore, we think the U.S. market rising trend should continue in the future.
Well, today the Korean markets were up and down, finally eking out a gain, though. Foreigners selling, retail investors selling too, at least on the Kospi. Tell us about the domestic market.
Right. If you look at the South Korea's business confidence numbers, it's clearly going down. It went down 2 points to 95 in August from 97 in previous month, and clearly still remains below 100. So economy seems to be doing quite weak per se with this kind of sentiment coming through. If you look at the currency movement, Korean won did go up to as high as 1177, and now it's back down to about 1170. But nevertheless, it's quite high. The overall consumer sentiment is also eased to 4-month low. It is at 102.5 in August, falling from 103.2. So sentiment-wise, it's not that positive. Everybody's concerned about the Delta variant of COVID, and that interest rate hike that happened yesterday is putting some sentiment weakness. All in all, Kospi did go down at the beginning of today, but it did recover slightly. Kospi was up by 0.17%. Kosdaq was up 0.3%. The reason for that is because U.S. market stabilization is expected with the futures market doing quite okay. And also overall export market remains to be quite interesting with the growth numbers still very strong. So all in all, there's mixed signals coming from Korea where domestic market versus export market, there's some sentiment differences with the export remaining very strong while domestic consumption remaining weak.
Well, finally, as you mentioned, Mr. Yu, yesterday, of course, the big news was the Bank of Korea raising rates, making Korea the first developed country to do that during the pandemic, up 25 basis points from their all-time low. The prospect of rates rising further and what that means for liquidity has been a major consideration for investors in the pandemic. What effect do you see this having on the stock market?
Right. The Bank of Korea did raise the base rate by 0.25%. To 0.75% in August. And some people are saying that they will raise another 0.25% by the end of the year. Clearly, there's a bit of a confusion here because the monetary policy is tightening on the basis of concern that the retail debt level is too high for Korea and that they need to tighten in order to reduce the consumer debt level as a percentage of GDP. It had hit about 103% plus as of now, and that is the third highest amongst the OECD country, and that is the concern for Korea. However, though, the raising interest rate in this kind of environment is very probably not a reasonable strategy for the time being. And if you look at the currency-wise, it didn't see any appreciation with the interest rate hike. We actually saw even slightly depreciation. Clearly, I think that investor as well, if you look at the U.S. investors or global investors as well as domestic investors are very confused about what kind of policies are coming. If you have a domestic economy not strong with a high level of consumer debt, and if they raise interest rate and also the banks are tightening the credit, that is very, very negative news. I think that they're saying that it is an important factor to do before U.S. raise interest rate. But we didn't even see any signs of raising interest rate by U.S. anytime right now. And foreigners are not, net buyer of Korean market again because of the raising interest rate. So this kind of news is not necessarily probably positive for Korea's long-term perspective. So we have to watch and see how foreign investors and global investors are looking at what BOK's decision has been. I'm not sure whether this has been very positive news for the market or Korean economy.
All very interesting points you make there. It was interesting to note that what happened in the exchange rate, and that didn't seem to budge at all with the raising of rates. Well, Mr. Yu, we have to leave it there for today. Thank you for sharing your insights with us, as always. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
South Korea has evacuated nearly 400 people from Afghanistan to protect them from potential reprisals by the Taliban. These are people who worked with the South Korean government in the past, along with their families. They'll be staying temporarily at a state-run facility in Jincheon County, about 90 kilometers southeast of Seoul, while the government helps them get settled. Paeunji has more.
At about 12:30 p.m. on Friday, 13 buses carrying 377 Afghan evacuees arrived at the National Human Resources Development Institute, escorted by police cars. The state-run facility in Jincheon County, Chungcheongbuk-do Province, will be used as a temporary shelter for the evacuees. Police have been patrolling the outskirts of the building since Friday morning, even before the evacuees arrived, and plan to be at the facility 24/7 to reassure local residents. 10 healthcare workers and 40 workers from the Justice Ministry will also be staying at the facility to help them settle.
For now, these people need to look after themselves. After self-quarantine, they will stay here for 6 more weeks. These are people who have been working with our government in Afghanistan, and some of them even speak a little Korean. They will probably settle in our country pretty well.
The 6-story building used as a temporary shelter can accommodate up to around 520 people. Last year, the same facility was used as a quarantine center for Koreans who were evacuated from Wuhan, China at the start of the pandemic. Local residents in Jincheon greeted the Afghans with welcome banners. One of them read, "Welcome to Korea, the country of freedom and peace." Some waved to them as the buses entered the facility.
It is true that there were worries at first, but residents here have decided to embrace them.
Although the evacuees were tested for COVID-19 upon arrival in the country, they will have 2 additional PCR tests during their 2-week quarantine period. As for their visa status, they will initially be given a short-term visa that allows them to stay in Korea for 90 days. After that visa expires, the Justice Ministry has decided to revise the law and grant them long-term stay permits. Paeunji, Arirang News, Jincheon.
And the last 13 of the Afghan evacuees arrived at Incheon International Airport this afternoon on board a Korean military plane. This last group had to wait another day on a stopover in Islamabad because there weren't enough seats for them on the plane Thursday that brought over 377 evacuees. Among that larger group, around half were young children. This successfully concludes South Korea's mission to evacuate 390 people from Afghanistan. The government said before that they'd bring back 391 Afghans, but one was sent back from Islamabad because it turned out that person was not on the list. And as the U.S. continues its evacuations from Kabul, a suicide bombing at the airport has killed more than 60 civilians and more than a dozen American troops. Responsibility has been claimed by the group ISIS-K. President Biden says the U.S. will hunt down the perpetrators. Min Soo-kyun reports.
Amid the ongoing U.S.-led evacuation from Afghanistan, suspected suicide bombers attacked the crowded gates of Kabul airport on Thursday. At least 2 explosions, one at the airport's Abbey Gate and another outside the nearby Barron Hotel, killed more than 60 civilians and at least 13 American soldiers. At least 140 people were wounded, and that number is expected to rise. The U.S. Defense Department confirmed that there were also several gunmen who opened fire on civilians and military forces after the explosion. While warning that more attacks against U.S. forces and those trying to leave the country are likely before the evacuation is over, the Pentagon said the emergency evacuation mission will continue.
Let me be clear. While we're saddened by the loss of life, both U.S. and Afghan, we're continuing to execute the mission. Our mission is to evacuate U.S. citizens, third country nationals, special immigrant visa holders, U.S. Embassy staff, and Afghans at risk.
ISIS-K claimed responsibility for the deadly attack but provided no evidence to support the claim. The Taliban condemned the blast, with the group's spokesperson taking to Twitter to claim the explosion took place in an area under the control of the American military. Calling it a tough day, President Biden had a clear message to the terrorists behind the attack.
To those who carried out this attack, as well as anyone who wishes America harm, know this: we will not forgive. We will not forget. We will hunt you down and make you pay.
Biden, who had previously pointed to the possibility of such attacks, also highlighted that Washington's mission will be completed. World leaders condemned Thursday's attacks, with the spokesperson to the UN Secretary-General saying that the UN chief is closely monitoring the situation. NATO and the European leaders have also strongly condemned the bombings, calling them a horrific terrorist attack that has targeted desperate Afghans trying to leave the country and the alliance's efforts to help their evacuation. Min Soo-kyun, Arirang News.
And turning to the pandemic, South Korea today reported more than 1,800 new cases of COVID-19. That's down from the recent peak, but a growing proportion of patients are seriously ill, and some regions face a shortage of hospital beds. The Chuseok holiday is less than a month away, and so the authorities will announce the rules on gatherings and nursing home visits after looking at the trend next week. Choi Min-jung reports.
South Korea confirmed 1,841 new cases of COVID-19 on Friday, staying above 1,000 for almost 2 months. All but 30 cases were locally transmitted, with most of them coming from the Greater Seoul area. The country is witnessing a slower increase in the number of infections in the capital region, while other areas are showing a slight drop. However, concerns are mounting over increasing number of critically ill patients. Not only that, hospital beds in some regions are almost fully occupied. Nationwide, 33% of beds for critically ill patients are available, but the cities of Daejeon and Sejong only have 1 and 2 beds left, respectively. There are also no hospital beds left for the less severely ill patients in Incheon and Gyeongsangbuk-do province. With the 4th wave of the pandemic still far from over, health authorities are reviewing whether to allow family gatherings and visits to nursing homes during the Chuseok holiday, also known as Korean Thanksgiving. Last year, people were asked to refrain from traveling.
We are planning to make a decision after monitoring the infection trend until next week. There are differing opinions among many experts, so we are planning to combine those opinions and analyze the situation.
As more people can now get vaccinated, health authorities say that the effect of vaccinations in blocking transmissions and reducing health risks will likely appear from mid-September when the Chuseok holiday begins. Choi Min-jung, Arirang News.
U.S. Forces Korea has decided to adopt a more flexible approach to mask wearing on its bases and will not require masks for vaccinated personnel in parts of Korea where there's a low number of coronavirus cases. USFK said in a press release that the policy starts Saturday. Masks will not be required on bases in regions where there have been fewer than 50 cases per 100,000 people over a period of 7 days or more. Regardless of the coronavirus incident rate, though, masks will be required for service members who are not vaccinated. Also, only vaccinated personnel will be allowed to visit facilities such as bars, clubs, saunas, bathhouses, and off-base gyms. Some of South Korea's public sector health workers are threatening to go on strike from September 2nd to demand better working conditions, having battled the pandemic now for more than a year and a half. The Korean Health and Medical Workers Union has more than 80,000 members and represents about 7% of Korea's medical professionals. They're in negotiations with the Ministry of Health and Welfare, which has said it will do its best to reach a deal, but will have emergency staff on standby in case the strike goes ahead. The union's demanding that hospitals and clinics add more staff, raise their pay, and limit the number of patients assigned to each nurse. And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.